Thanks for coming, Dr. Koroshetz. That's fantastic to have you here, and thanks for giving everyone insight into how the department's working these days. We have big questions, so thanks for answering some of them. We're going to shift for a little bit. 2 years ago at the Global Research Convention here in this room, we were giving our patient talks and talking about all the challenges with CMT drug development. And a woman stood up at the back and she raised her hand. She said, "How are you engaging with the FDA?" And so I pulled her to the side and I told her about some of the efforts we had done, a listening session and a couple other phone calls that we had made. And she said, "Have you ever thought about doing a guidance document?" And I didn't know what a guidance document was. So she talked to me a little bit about it. And her name is Shannon Strom. And Shannon is the VP of Regulatory at Aerogen Pharmaceuticals. But she's also a woman who lives with CMT1B. So as a regulator or someone who works with a regulator, she knew how you needed to navigate the FDA. As a patient, she knew that we were lacking this in the CMT world. So she challenged me and then became my partner in crime. And we put together a group, which we call ToPIC, which is Together Patients, Industry, and Clinicians, to write and draft some guidance documents. And as soon as we came up with the idea, we emailed Peter Marks and Michelle Campbell and Teresa Berdicchio at FDA, and they said, "Great, we can't wait to get it." And now they're no longer there. So Shannon's going to give us a little overview of the ToPIC committee and what we've accomplished and then where we're going from here. So come on to the stage, Shannon. Thank you so much.
All right, so now for something completely different in that there will be no data slides. All right, let's see if I can work this. All right, so as Susan said, 2 years ago, I was in the patient day. I'm a patient with CMT1B and was really inspired and thought, how can I contribute? How can I make a difference? And so this is what we came up with. So a little bit about myself. My PhD is in pharmacology, so I talk science, but it's been a while since I've been in the lab. I've spent the last 20 plus years in inhalation drug development and have had the honor to work on really complex drug device combination products that aim to aerosolize medicines and get them down into the lungs for things like COPD and asthma. Excuse me. And have been able to bring multiple products from the very early stage testing all the way through to an approval. And so I think that my unique experience being a patient, but also being someone who's worked in the drug development industry for a long time, made this a natural fit. All right, it worked. So this is an ongoing collaboration, and ToPIC does stand for Together Patients, Industry, and Clinicians versus CMT. And this is actually a collaboration between 5 patient advocacy groups, 5 clinicians, and actually 9 different pharmaceutical companies. And actually, that's a total of 39 people, many of whom are in this room today. And the goal was to standardize approaches for how we design clinical trials for new treatments in CMT. So Terry showed the Mount Everest slide earlier. So my goal here is to start putting some ladders on the mountain and make it easier to climb. So, and the way we're going to do that is by providing a clear set of expectations to regulators on what is clinically meaningful to patients, what matters to us, right? May not be the thing that is easiest to measure in a clinical study, but it's the most important thing for us. And also to give clear objective assessments for the development companies to understand what a significant improvement looks like. And all of this, again, is designed, pharma companies, they're a little conservative, right? These trials cost a lot of money, hundreds of millions of dollars from some of these trials. And so anything that you can do to decrease the risk will bring more investment into that space. This is one of only a few collaborations like this in the rare disease community. We're actually aware of only one other project like this, which we modeled ourselves after. It's called the Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy, which is working in the Duchenne space. They actually are one patient advocacy group that worked with a few physicians, and we thought, well, hang on, let's be collaborative here and let's get everybody involved. And so these are the all the different organizations that have made contributions to this. And I can't thank everyone enough for the efforts they've put in on this. So the committee was organized. We had the full committee, but we broke them down into 6 subcommittees that were responsible for creating the content of that document. And we had a steering committee that basically were the chairpersons of each of the subcommittees. And those committees were chaired by people from the different patient advocacy groups. So this is very much a patient-centered community that we're working with here. And so I just wanted to call each of them out because this has been a huge undertaking over the last year. So the natural history, diagnosis, trial design, and outcome measures was chaired by Dr. Sue Brune from the CMT Association. The patient experience subcommittee was chaired by our very own Susan Rudiger from the CMTRF. Biomarkers and surrogate endpoints was chaired by Dr. Catherine Forsey, who's also from the CMT Association. Even though I'm not a member of any of the patient advocacy groups, I did chair the safety committee. The gene therapy committee was chaired by Brian Lim from the Muscular Dystrophy Association. Sorry, CMT cough, it's annoying. And pediatric development subcommittee was chaired by Susie McCune, who also isn't a part of any of the patient advocacy groups, but she's actually the former chief pediatrician at FDA. And she actually met a family who had a child with CMT, and that led her to volunteer for this project. Oh, sorry, how do I go back? There we go. So what is a guidance document from FDA? If you haven't worked on this before, you probably have never seen one, but they do list them on their website. And basically what FDA does is they issue these guidance documents. They're for a specific disease. So they have ones for migraine and for osteoporosis and COPD. And basically it describes what their current thinking is for what it's going to take to get a product approved, meaning that that product has a positive benefit to risk profile. And so it describes if you do these types of trial designs with these types of endpoints and these types of patient populations, as long as the data does show that benefit of efficacy and an acceptable safety profile, then that's a product that could be approved by the agency. And so this very greatly de-risks these very expensive clinical development programs for drug developers. And there's a very clear correlation when FDA does issue one of these guidance documents that it does attract more investment from the pharmaceutical industry into that particular indication space. So as Susan said, our goal was to work on this guidance document. We had buy-in from FDA that if we create the first draft, that they would come in and really start to work with us to come up with a final version that they could put their stamp on and make it their standard, right? And so that was the plan at the outset. We'll tell you what happens afterwards, but this is the first time that we're going public with what the recommendations from this guidance document, at least from our perspective, is going to be. And we've taken a really aggressive, very cutting edge approach, taking into account the recent trends in the rare disease community that FDA has been fostering. And we know that CMT is very diverse, right? There's a huge range of symptoms and severity. And so the guidance document tries to create a set of general principles that would cover the entire community. This is a challenge. So let's start with study populations. First, historically, phase 1 trials, these are the first in human trials where they're really looking at proof of concept. So it's looking at a single dose of the drug safe, and how do our bodies metabolize that drug? Those are typically done in healthy volunteers, and we're advocating that they should allow patients to participate in those phase 1 studies to gain earlier access to some of these potentially life-altering treatments. The next one is that, again, historically, drugs are developed typically in the adult population first, and then once that's been established and proven, you would go down to younger and younger age groups that are affected by that same disease. We believe that in order to preserve as much function as possible in this chronically progressive illness, that we should allow the youngest patients in from the very beginning, right? As long as that's scientifically justified and ethically justifiable. So meaning, have you done your juvenile toxicology studies to allow younger kids into the population? Let's let them in the trial from the beginning. And then around enrollment criteria, a lot of the trials now you have to have a confirmed genetic diagnosis of a particular subtype of CMT to be able to be allowed into the trial. And we'd like to change that thinking because there are a lot of really rare subtypes that are never going to have enough subjects to enroll into a study where they'd actually get an approval for that subtype. And also, there's estimates that 25 to 40% of people don't have a confirmed genetic diagnosis. And so those patients are automatically excluded from those trials. So instead of relying on a genetic diagnosis, we believe that if there's a common clinical phenotype that the drug's mechanism of action could benefit from, then let's base the enrollment criteria on that, right? And I think a great example of that is our friends from NMD Pharma. Their mechanism of action suggests that it could affect a wide range of CMC subtypes, and they're allowing all of those into the trial. And the reason why this is important is because there's something called an indication statement. That's FDA's term for what is this drug going to treat. And if they limit it down to a specific subtype, right? So we're only going to get approved for CMT1B, for instance. Insurance is only going to cover it for those patients, even though it may work for other subtypes that weren't tested in the clinical study. If we allow more people in, then more people can be included in that insurance coverage. So trial designs. Again, historically, and still to this day, the gold standard in clinical drug development are placebo-controlled trials. That is because it eliminates bias on the treatment outcome by knowing what treatment a person was on during the study. But again, for a chronic progressive disease like CMT, we believe that we should be looking at alternative options such as historical controls and things like that. And I think that the industry has done, the clinicians have done a really fantastic job in the natural history studies to be able to gather that data that could be used for those historical controls. We want to continue to develop endpoints that can reliably assess that huge spectrum of disease severity that we see. And that's a really tall order, but the clinicians in this community, in this room, have really risen up to that challenge, right? And they have started developing these endpoints. And so the guidance doesn't call for a specific primary endpoint because we want this to be valid for years to come, right? And so we want to leave room for the development of new things that we haven't even thought about yet and be able to incorporate those into cutting edge research in the clinic for CMT. However, we do say wherever possible that the assessment tools that have been developed specifically for CMT, like the CMT FOM, the CMT-NS, the CMT High, those should always be used rather than the ONLS, right? The ONLS has a proven track record of failure in the CMT space, so let's not keep using that. Okay, so accelerated approval, and what is it? Accelerated approval can be gained if you have a biomarker that has an earlier readout than what your final clinical response endpoint would be. You can ask for approval based off of that data. So an example of this could be, let's just say the trial perhaps is a 2-year trial, and at the end of the trial, the measurement is % change on the CMT FOM. But maybe this is a CMT1A trial, and so you're also measuring decreases in PMP22 expression. And maybe by 6 months, you're showing a steady and reliable decline in PMP2 expression. We think at some point that PMP2 decreased expression could be the biomarker that serves for the accelerated approval, gets the product out 18 months faster. And then you get the confirmation of that when the CMT FOM data would come in. So that's just one example. I'm not advocating for that particular scenario. For gene therapy products, if you have a functional change in the protein that you're trying to change in the gene therapy, and I think a great example is in SWORD, right? So if you can show now suddenly, hey, you weren't expressing this and now you are, you shouldn't have to wait that whole 2 years for the trial to finish. If you're showing expression of a protein that wasn't being expressed before, or you're showing decrease in a protein that needed to come down, well, why not base approval off of that? And we do mention that there are some biomarkers that we should start to consider as validated biomarkers, such as the quantitative muscle fat fraction and some of the other ones that we've talked about today, like the digital health technologies that we think should be incorporated into the trials now. So where are we right now? The original goal was to interact with FDA and get this published as an FDA guidance. And FDA had agreed to participate. Unfortunately, with the changes that have been happening throughout the whole government, but in particular at FDA, they no longer have the resources to participate in this program. So they've actually withdrawn their participation in this committee with us. So instead, we've refocused. And we're going to work on publishing this in an academic journal, probably one of the neurology journals, that would allow us to continue to have full community access here, right? So that's where we are right now. We should be ready to submit that to one of the journals in the next few weeks. And so hoping for a publication very soon thereafter. And I think this is really important because it allows the pharmaceutical companies to be able to use that document in your negotiations with FDA, where you can say, look, this is what's important to the patients. This is where the clinicians are with the development of natural history studies. Let's use what's important to this community when we're designing the clinical studies. And clinicians and researchers like yourselves can use that as justification for continuing to develop the new endpoints that are going to take us even further and getting more products approved. And we may be able at some point to re-engage with FDA. So that hasn't been ruled out. They do want to participate. It's just a staffing issue right now. So hopefully at some point in the future that will change. So I think that's everything. I want to thank everyone for, particularly the CMTRF, for allowing me to speak today. And I hope that in a year from now, we're going to be talking about the published paper. Thank you, guys.
Take a few questions then.
Right here.
Oh, yes.
Thank you for doing this. This is really helpful for those of us in industry. What do you recommend in terms of patient enrollment? How do you group patients, or what types of patients should we enroll in a certain trial, given the diversity of the population and the small numbers within specific subtypes?
That's a great question. It's always a challenge, right? Because as a pharmaceutical company, you're investing a huge amount of money in these trials, and you want to have a very homogeneous patient population to show the proof of concept and the size of the treatment effect, right? But we, as the community, want as many of us in the trial as we can get. And so there's this inherent conflict between them. I think ultimately it's going to depend on the mechanism of action of the drug. And so if it's a gene therapy and it's targeted to a very specific subtype, then I think those are going to be very, very small trials. But if it's something that has a mechanism that could affect across the wide range, I think you should take all comers to me. But again, I'm biased because I'm a patient. Yes.
Thank you again for putting this together and for the committee as well. As a drug discovery and developer, and all the companies that right now are either communicating with the FDA
Yeah.
or about to start communicating with the FDA, what would you advise them and how to engage with you, the committee,
Mhm.
to then communicate to the FDA with a unified voice? Because this publication is going to be very helpful, but as you know, with this types of rare conditions,
Yeah.
it's always great to have the patient community behind the developer. So how would you recommend that?
Yeah, I think that's also a great question. And I know each of the patient advocacy groups have a core group of patients who are very willing to come and talk to the agency with you. I'm willing to come and talk with them, with you. And I know anyone on the committee would gladly help you in any way that we can prepare for those meetings. How do you approach them? There's this saying in the pharma regulatory world, which is a very insular world, that FDA believes in God we trust and everybody else bring the data. And that's what you need to do, right? Is bring the data and have a really open conversation with them about, if this is a pre-IND meeting, really talk about the pharmacological work that you've done to demonstrate why you believe the drug is going to work, what the tox data is showing. And honestly, in this rare disease space, they have been more and more open to these novel and innovative ideas in recent years. And so I think that's a really good sign that they're going to continue to engage. And even though they are facing a very severe staffing shortage right now, they are continuing to prioritize those types of interact meetings that Walter was talking about earlier. And again, I think that's because of the importance that they're placing on this space. Yes.
How little I understand about drug discovery
That's okay.
or approval, but are there no foreign bodies that would benefit from this same document?
Yes, 100%. So the committee's what our original phase 2 was. So phase 1 was get it approved with the FDA and then start talking to the other global health authorities. So FDA in Europe is called EMA, and there's Health Canada for Canada that we heard about earlier. And we would love to be able to bring it to all of those bodies. And to be fair, there are slight differences in the regulations between each of them, but for the most part, they want the same things. Yeah.
Yeah, this is not a question, but I really want to appreciate you put together a documentation that is going to help just not this community, but many of the other rare diseases. I just want to add also the optimism, for example, the 7-month-old baby.
I mean, amazing, right?
That is one. Terry's story by itself, and also to take the optimism from the fact that FDA accelerated the approval of tofersen for ALS with one biomarker surrogate endpoint of NFL that showed a 55% decrease in the level. So I think FDA is open to dialogue, and coming from a sister or brother agency, I don't know how to call it, but we constantly have these conversations. And as again, Walter mentioned about the AMP ALS, we have the AMP ALS where we are constantly in dialogue with Critical Path Institute and FDA to talk about regulatory readiness. Just as we have clinical trial readiness, there should be conversations about regulatory readiness. And from all that perspective, just what you've done now and what you're doing is much appreciated. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. And I agree with you. I think that I think FDA has really entered the golden age of really focusing on rare diseases. They've just recently, in 2024, issued a whole toolkit of tools that drug developers can use for when they're in that rare disease space, because they recognize that, sometimes that financial incentive isn't really there, and they're trying to do what they can to facilitate development for the more rare diseases.
Great. Well, let's
Yeah.
thank Shannon again. This was a great session.